to the faculty, the dean of the faculty, and the dean of the faculty immediately withdrew that person from their job, and they were sacked. Now, you know, we have some wonderful Christian advocates here in Australia, and some lawyers who are giving themselves to help people out in these situations, and so they were contacted, and after some legal letters, because these people had no actual legal ground to do this, they pulled back, and the person was put back in his job, but not before some pretty classy legal brains went and challenged what was done. So here's this thing: there is stuff going on to attack us, but why are we surprised about that? What is much more difficult to deal with? See, I'm not all that afraid of the direct attacks of the devil. You know, I've been in a few situations where there have been demonic manifestations, and you know, and they're reasonably simple to deal with. What I'm worried about is, I'm worried about people who are just apathetic. I'm worried about Christians being apathetic. I'm worried about Christians being, you know, sitting down in their chairs and doing nothing when the world outside them is crying out for some rescuing and saving message. And the reason why they sit down in their chairs and turn on Netflix is not because they don't have access to the Word of God. We have more opportunity to read the Word of God in Australia than many other parts of the world, and as good as some. You know, we have more churches to go to. We have more programs to listen to. We've got more podcasts to listen to. We've got more places of worship. And yet people are sitting down in their chairs watching Netflix when they should be out bringing the message, bringing the ministry, bringing the heart of God to some place where the heart of God is desperately needed. The spirit of the city has invaded the church. Now let me tell you where I got that from, because some years ago I was in Fiji sharing in a conference there, and it was a great conference, and it's quite a while ago now, but there was a guy there from England doing the first session every day. He did this kind of Bible study thing in the morning, and it was really great, and he did it on the seven churches that are mentioned in the book of Revelation, Revelation chapters 2 and 3, and he'd done a lot of research to show what was going on in these cities. And he talked about the fact that the churches in those cities had, you know, thrived. And the passage I just talked to you about from Acts 19, where, you know, Paul went there for 3 years. He taught in the hall of Tyrannus. And in that time, the people who learned, the people who were equipped, they were filled with passion for the lost people of the Asia Minor province. And all those churches, those 7 churches that are listed there in the book of Revelation, were all in the province of Asia. And so when it says, and all Asia, all the Greeks and Jews in Asia heard the word of the Lord, they heard the word of the Lord not because Paul did massive crusades. They heard the word of the Lord because somebody who was equipped, somebody who was had been through all the difficulties and hardships that the church in Ephesus had experienced, in all the coming and going that went on in the city. The whole city was in uproar because, you know, there were economic problems and so forth with the sale of statues of Diana, and they had a big book burning and all those sorts of things in the city. But that's all exciting. But what's more exciting is what you don't hear about, what we don't have recorded, and that is ordinary, unknown believers being equipped in the hall of Tyrannus, going out and planting churches. And so Paul even writes to some of those churches, and he hasn't even been there. Somebody that is trained has been there. Somebody that is supported has been there. Somebody who got something from heaven because of him went there. And they went there because there was nothing there. And when there was nothing there, somebody came from the hall of Tyrannus, a group of people came, and a church was planted there. For example, in Colossae. And so we have a letter in the New Testament to the Colossian church, and Paul hadn't been there, and he hadn't been to the city of Laodicea. One of the other cities anyway. And so then 40 years later, when John is on the island of Patmos, because he was not prepared to honour Caesar as Lord, and because supposedly, according to Eusebius or one of those quite well recognised church historians, they tried to burn John in oil and he wouldn't burn, so then they put him on the island of Patmos, just a little way off the coast of Asia Minor and not far from Ephesus and all those places. So when he's out there in his old age and he's in the Spirit one day, I just love that idea. He was in the Spirit on the Lord's day, and he saw this amazing revelation. I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day. Anyway, there's a lot of things I would like to say about that, because it's quite possible that the Lord's Day wasn't just talking about Sunday. It's actually an adjective, the Lordly Day. And interestingly enough, the use of that word, it's only used once in the New Testament. In other parts of the Mediterranean, that same term is used to describe the day on which some Caesar who got insecure and thought that everybody ought to, turn up somewhere in a public place and say, Caesar is Lord, Caesar is Lord, well then that day was called the Lord's Day. That was called the Lord's Day. And the story that goes with this, which is an interesting story, is that John was arrested that day. He wasn't prepared to honour Caesar as Lord. He was prepared to acknowledge him as the ruling governor of the Roman Empire, but he wasn't, because he had to say, no, there is another one who is Lord. There's only one who has maximum authority, and it isn't Caesar. It is Jesus as Lord. And so it's on this day, maybe an anniversary of the day that he was arrested, that he was in the Spirit. He wasn't just lamenting the loss of his freedom. He wasn't sitting there feeling sorry for himself because he was on an island and cut off from all those things. He was in the Spirit. He was in connection with the Father and the Son by the Spirit. Now, that's the best way to celebrate the anniversary of your arrest. And on that day, the Spirit of God came to him, and amidst all of that amazing revelation that he saw was that Jesus sent 7 prophetic messages. And he said, go find the messenger who's going to go to the church in Ephesus, and find the messenger to go to the church in Smyrna and in Thyatira and in Sardis and in Pergamum and in Laodicea and so forth, Philadelphia. And so he sends messages, and when he sends these messages to the churches, he's sending a message, an individual message to an individual church. And get this, he is sending a message to the church. Yeah, we've got so many institutions these days, and I'm the head of a group of churches, a network of churches, but we don't have so much institutional structure. We just have relationships. But if I was going to go to a church that was having some problems, and think about this, the churches in Revelation started with revival. The churches in Revelation started with the cities being impacted, totally being impacted by the gospel of Jesus, by the new believers, by disciples making disciples, by the word of God taking its effect, by people being in connection. It wasn't without controversy, and it wasn't without any kind of difficulty. But these churches impacted their cities, and the profound presence of Jesus in those cities caused an upheaval, and the upheaval brought the light from heaven into the darkness. And yet 40 years later, these churches, even though there are a lot of good things about them, and the reason I'm saying this is I can think of so many good things about the church in Korea. There are so many things that I'm grateful for. There are so many things that I'm amazed at. I've been there a number of times, and I've seen so much of the great work of God that's been done, and I've read many of the pioneering stories of the early days of last century when the church was just a small struggling people, and where there was no strength and no great power, no great influence, and where pastors, men and women rose up and began to preach the gospel, and they were hunted and hounded, and they were treated horribly, and yet they prevailed. They prayed, they cried out to God, and when they stopped praying, they started obeying with the strength that they had from their encounter with Jesus. And so, I've read all those stories, and the same was true for the churches in Revelation. When you read about all these things, You know, I see your faithfulness, I see you've persevered, I see. And it's not that these churches have nothing good about them. He's not just cascading these churches for being horrible people. These people are good people. These people are faithful people. But these people are being affected by the spirit of the city. And the spirit, and when I was in Fiji, that's what I started to say. I was in Fiji at this conference. This lovely guy from Great Britain was speaking, and he was showing how in every case the problems that were existing in the church, that were curtailing the effect, that had stopped the effect of revival, where the influence had now turned the other way. On the one hand, the church was influencing the community. It wasn't influencing the community by putting people in political posts. It wasn't because they could change all the laws. It wasn't because all their people were the heads of various sectors of the community. There was none of that. As far as we know, there was none of that. In fact, there was so little of that that Paul could say of one particular church, look among you, there's nobody there who's of great stature, of great importance and great status. This was a people's movement. Not entirely, but it was a people's movement. Because here were people filled with the Spirit. Here were people shaped by the Word of God. Here were people bold and courageous in their faith. To go and say, no, hear the word of heaven. Hear heaven's word. Hear the word of love. Hear the word of redemption. Hear the word of forgiveness. Hear the word. We are here to turn this thing around. And yet, in the 40 years that had happened since those things had happened, here were the churches, and things were happening inside of them that were threatening their very existence. Their impact had been already threatened, and their impact was dying. But they were still doing things. And I feel this is the word now. We need to understand that the spirit of the city, the spirit of the culture, has invaded the church. It's been doing it quietly. It hasn't come in as a power struggle amongst the eldership.